So my thesis is that similar to how the abortion issue was a foundational approach to the original religious right, and how ecumenical thinking was sort of instantiated to put aside differences. To me, a lot of the cultural mode that you see online nowadays, either from the far left to the far right, or the middle, or the centrist, or whatever, comes out of the sort of original movement that took really well to the internet and internet culture, and to YouTube especially, which was the new atheist movement. You can trace the lineage of things like Gamergate to new atheism, both opposed and for Gamergate. Because remember, a lot of the original people in Gamergate, they were they were new atheists, essentially. And the people that were against them in the video game journalist industry, people who were part of Tumblr culture, they were also a part of what they called atheism plus. So you have a groundwork where the beginning of internet culture starts in this sort of first the tech bro, like, optimism of the Californian ideology, then new atheism took off like wildfire. Like, you literally could not be a religious person at all from like 2006 to 2013. It was impossible. There was a few brave people that were essentially like evangelical trolls on YouTube. But when it comes to like the current religiosity of what you term the new religious right, it's explicitly more of a traditionalist character. It's Catholicism, Orthodoxy, the few Protestants there, they may have background within like old school evangelism, sorry. A lot of Mormons, but essentially the reason I point to the new atheist movement is because that's sort of the way in which religiosity, either for or against, and the way in which cultural politics are spread and transformed and shaped by the internet, by meme culture. This was all born from the cauldron of the new atheist movement. And so the reaction to that a few years later, after Gamergate, after 2016, culminates in sort of the inherently religious impulse of what I guess you would call the online right or the dissident right or so forth. And you start to have, I think around 2013, 14, 15, you start to have a sort of thawing out of the hardcore atheistic sentiment among online spaces. And this leads into the sort of cultural battleground that we find ourselves in nowadays. Because remember, even the people on the other side, the people that were, I guess what we call SJWs, that's an antiquated term, nowadays, but they were also part of this sort of original milieu. The first guy to actually be canceled, believe it or not, was Richard Dawkins. That Rebecca Watson person accused him. Yeah, I think it was coffee or something. He asked to have a cup of coffee. Yeah. So, sorry, I'm just rambling right now, but this is sort of the groundwork of from which religiosity in the internet age could be expressed. But lastly, though, before you ask me something else, I will say that I was trying to think of like, okay, what can I say? Going through my notes, I think that it was a natural and organic progression because the way in which the internet as a medium transforms not only discourse, but our ways of thinking, to me, I know this is going to sound really crazy, but it almost inherently pulls towards a sort of metaphysics in a way, or metaphysical thinking rather. So why do we have, young men who wear three-piece suits and look like G.K. Chesterton and go to an SSPX church? Why do we have TikTok witches that put hexes on Justice Alito or Orange Man, right? Why do we have these things? Why is it nowadays that we're seeing this sort of revival of that? Because remember, if you want to go back even further to the 1990s and then to the early 2000s, you very much have this sort of progressive disenchantment with faith in general. And so this is where I think you could lead off from what Professor Young was saying, in that during the 1990s, like, the religious right was bodied basically by various, whether you want to call them organic or forced, various cultural forces that just made it quote unquote uncool to be a person of faith, right? But then the early 2000s happened, and then you have the new atheist movement. Now you have this sort of with the rise, I would say with the rise of from, post-Soviet Union, global neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, the end of history, from the time of sort of the Western way of thinking about things that have culminated up to that point with, global liberalism, even after a little bit, after the Twin Towers fell, you still had this sort of, I would say, ironically enough, this heaven period, this grace period, where this sort of materialist thinking went hand in hand with the political thinking at the time of, this sort of passive left libertarian way of thinking about politics and about life, that we're in the best possible period in history, that there no longer is political disagreement or religious or cultural disagreement, that we've solved all of these problems, quote unquote. This is when you have the rise of new atheism. But then, almost kind of like what Samuel P. Huntington said about politics, that, this can't last after the towers fell. It seems that sort of equanimity in thinking about culture and politics and religion, that also couldn't have lasted, because the root of it was that the new atheist movement and the political apparatus that it favored, which again, passive global liberalism, that couldn't have lasted because it doesn't provide, I guess what people like, cliched enough Jordan Peterson and people like him and my good friend Jonathan Pajou and others call the crisis of meaning, right? Crisis of meaning. Way before people were talking about that. Like, I mean, this is what these bloggers, these obscure right-wing bloggers were talking about, essentially. And so you start to see that, especially nowadays, when you have this mass disenchantment, you have this mass sort of insecurity, both in politics and in culture, whether it be, the towers falling, whether it be 2008, Occupy Wall Street, Gamergate, so forth. You have this sort of increased uncoupling of the consensus reality, essentially. And this is the sort of milieu that a new religious movement, either on the political left or right, both in fact, because I would argue that there are religious sentiments on the political left as well. Although for a time, they sort of had to slough off their like affinity for like new age woo thinking like they had in the 80s and somewhat in the early 90s. They had to put it this way, the political left for a time in the 2000s, they peeled off their Free Tibet sticker and they put in the Darwin fish. That was the big thing, the Darwin fish. Remember the bumpy sticker?
My dad had one.
Of course. But as time goes on, though, you do start to see, you still have nowadays this sort of like the atheistic like consensus among certain class of people on the political left. But then you also start to see in the political left a sort of neo-religiosity as well.